I didn't correct them, not because they were right, and not because I agreed with what was being said. I didn't correct them because the moment didn't seem to require it. The conversation was already moving in a certain direction, and stopping it would have introduced friction that felt unnecessary. Correcting them would have meant interrupting the flow, shifting the tone, asking the moment to slow down and accommodate precision. It felt easier to let the misunderstanding pass, easier to allow the statement to remain as it was, unadjusted, unchallenged. There was no single thought behind the decision, no internal debate where I weighed truth against comfort. It happened quietly, almost automatically. A brief pause where I recognized the inaccuracy, followed by a choice that didn't feel like a choice at all. I stayed silent. The conversation continued. Nothing broke. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Correcting them would have required explanation. Explanation would have required emphasis. Emphasis would have made the moment heavier than it needed to be, so I let it go. The statement wasn't harmful. It didn't distort anything in an obvious way. It didn't change the outcome of the conversation. From the outside, it barely mattered. And because it barely mattered, it felt safe to ignore. I told myself that accuracy wasn't always necessary, that not every detail needed to be addressed, that sometimes understanding the intention behind a statement was more important than correcting its form. I believed that restraint was a kind of maturity, that choosing not to correct someone could be a sign of emotional intelligence, a way of prioritizing connection over correctness. And in some situations that might be true, but this wasn't one of them. I didn't stay silent to preserve connection. I stayed silent because correcting them felt inconvenient. It would have slowed things down. It would have required me to take a position, to step slightly out of alignment with the ease of the moment. So I chose alignment instead. The conversation moved forward without resistance. Everyone remained comfortable. No one felt challenged or interrupted. From the outside, it looked like cooperation, like flexibility, like someone who knew when to let small things slide. And for a while, that interpretation held. The moment passed. The conversation ended. There was no immediate sense of loss or regret, which made it easy to believe that not correcting them had been the right choice. But what I didn't notice at first was how quickly that silence became a pattern. Each time a detail was slightly off, slightly simplified, slightly misrepresented, I responded the same way. I noticed it. I registered the inaccuracy, and then I let it pass. Not because I didn't care, but because caring would have required engagement. Correcting someone introduces friction. It interrupts momentum. It asks the moment to pause and recalibrate. And I had learned to value momentum. The problem wasn't that I didn't correct them. The problem was how easily I accepted being misunderstood. Over time, the distinction between what I knew and what was being said began to blur. Not externally, the world continued as it always does, but internally something shifted. I became quicker to let inaccuracies stand, quicker to prioritize smoothness over clarity, quicker to choose silence when speaking would have complicated things. It didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like efficiency. Why correct something if the correction wouldn't change the outcome? Why interrupt if nothing important seemed to be at stake? That logic was difficult to argue with. And because it went unchallenged, it became my default. There were moments later when I noticed a subtle discomfort. Not strong enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to be felt. A sense that I had been present without fully participating, that I had allowed my understanding to remain unspoken, untested, unacknowledged. The words that weren't said didn't disappear. They accumulated quietly. Each uncorrected moment added a small layer of distance between what I knew and what was accepted as true in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself as a problem, which is why it lasted. I began to notice how often I withheld clarification, how quickly I assumed that accuracy was optional, how rarely I allowed myself to disrupt a moment in service of precision. I realized then that silence doesn't always mean agreement, but it often functions as endorsement. When you don't correct something, you allow it to settle, to become part of the shared understanding. And over time, those unchallenged assumptions begin to shape expectations. People respond to what they believe you are saying, even when you haven't said it. I hadn't corrected them, but I had allowed their version to stand. That was the part I hadn't accounted for. Correcting someone isn't just about accuracy. It's about presence, about deciding whether the moment deserves your full engagement. By staying silent, I had chosen distance over participation, not because I wanted to withdraw, but because participation felt heavier. It required more attention, more responsibility, more willingness to sit with the discomfort of interruption. I had mistaken quiet for neutrality, but it wasn't neutral. It shaped how I was perceived. It shaped what was remembered. It shaped what went unexamined. There were times when the misunderstanding resurfaced later, larger than it had been originally, more embedded, harder to address without unraveling the conversation entirely. By then, correcting it felt disproportionate. Too late, too disruptive. So I stayed silent again. That was when I understood that the cost of not correcting something is rarely immediate. It accumulates.